The Russian and Soviet imperial narratives try to persuade us that Ukrainian culture is provincial. It is not. It is very global and is enshrined in many interesting topics of the wider world. In this episode, we delve into these trajectories of ideas. You are listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher and the chief editor of UkraineWorld, as well as the president of PEN Ukraine. My co-author today is Tetyana Ogarkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar and author of the French language podcast L'Ukraine face à la guerre by the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. We are lecturers at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, the oldest university in Ukraine. Moreover, I am Tetyana's husband. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internet Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. We greatly appreciate your support for our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your contribution is crucial as our media increasingly depends on crowdfunding. Additionally, you can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas where we provide aid to both soldiers and civilians. We bring essential supplies such as cars for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips by donating through PayPal at ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is produced in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. So let's begin. So in this episode we will try to analyze the global scene on which Ukrainian culture has been developing over the past several centuries. Why we decided to talk about this? Because you know what the imperial discourse, Russian and Soviet discourses were trying to do with the Ukrainian culture and with many other cultures is provincialize them. And provincialization is a very important concept here. The provincialization means that you're actually saying that the content of your culture valid only for very specific group, very provincialized group, maybe uneducated, and it has no global meaning. It has no meaning for other people. It has no universalist meaning. And the problem is that this discourse was quite dominant, and unfortunately it is still present in the minds of many Ukrainian people who consider the Ukrainian culture, as a second-rate or third-rate. And of course, we Ukrainian intellectuals are struggling against this. So, Tanya, let's try to talk about this and maybe start with some general idea. How would you see the Ukrainian culture inscribed into the European and the global context?
First of all, I'd like to agree with what you were saying about this provincializing of the Ukrainian culture. And this battle precisely is about high culture and local, about peasants culture. So for many centuries of Russian Empire and for many decades of the Soviet Empire, Ukrainian culture when not banned directly, so we do remember about all the bans about Ukrainian Renaissance, which were literally killed in 20s and 30s of the 20th century. This Ukrainian culture, when alive, was presented as something local and something like peasants culture, like popular culture. So, and Russian culture, empire culture, imperialistic culture, was presented as being a high culture. So it's pretty common to see how Russians argue that Russian literature and Russian culture is somehow great culture and great literature, and that it is in the dialogue, in direct dialogue with European culture and literature. For example, we all remember all these French-speaking elites of the Russian society back in the 19th century, etc., etc. And so this Ukrainian culture considered to be like provincial culture, like local, like peasants culture for many decades. So when we take a closer look at what was going on in this culture, we'll quite easily see how many links there are between Ukrainian culture and European culture, and how important and how universal our questions are and were during the previous centuries. So, and this dialogue is somehow very important, and in which way Russian Empire assimilated a lot of Ukrainian talents, presenting them as being Russian or Soviet talents, so erasing any trace of them being Ukrainian. We'll talk a little bit later today about Ukrainian avant-garde, which became suddenly Russian avant-garde and which known worldwide as specifically as Russian avant-garde. So a lot of battles are included in what we'll be talking about today, and let's maybe put an accent and emphasis on the seriousness and universal character of the questions which were asked here in this geography, in this country, and the global importance of these questions, right?
Absolutely. And I remember, for example, a Ukrainian writer, Markovovchok, a female writer, woman's writer, who basically was one of those who started Ukrainian prose. And by the way, he was born not on the territory of Ukraine, current Ukraine. He was born in Russia, and he had Russian origins as well. But he really entered the Ukrainian literary scene with her Народні оповідання, the popular stories, which were about the life of ordinary people, of peasants. But when she wanted to enter the big psychological novel, which was, developing in the Russian context, it was the moment when Ukrainian language literature was banned, and she was not able to print in Ukrainian. And maybe she herself was kind of thinking, okay, Russian is the language to write a big psychological novel, and therefore she wrote this novel, Живая душа, a live soul. And there are many other examples of that. This is stereotype which existed in the Russian Empire in the 19th century, that the big things you can write only in Russian. Well, you can write ethnographic things about the life of peasants, but the big things should be in Russian. You mentioned avant-garde. This is something that you really work upon. So tell me about, we will have another episode, the full episode about Ukrainian avant-garde soon, but if we put it into the more general context, tell me what's interesting about it.
Yeah, but maybe, yes, let's talk about avant-garde. But before talking about avant-garde, let's talk about the previous times. I mean, about the modernist time in Ukraine. So modernist time as something that precedes this Ukrainian avant-garde, which is extremely bright and brilliant time in the Ukrainian culture. Let's talk, for example, about such a personality in our literature as Olga Kobylanska. I do remember we were kids, we were reading Olga Kobylanska, her novel Zemля, so land, right, in school, and we never imagined how interesting and how important this literature figure is, this writer is in our culture. So let's start saying that Olga Kobylanska was born in a German-speaking language context. So she was not Ukrainian speaker as Markovovchok, by the way. So Markovovchok was born speaking Russian, and she made her choice to write.
She also learned Ukrainian. Yes, yeah. Ukrainian was not her native language.
And Kobylanska, a couple of friendships with prominent Ukrainian female personalities made this choice in favor of the Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian language. But at the same time, Olga Kobylanska she was writing her first articles and texts in German, and she was sending them to the German reviews, and they were published in German-speaking magazines somewhere abroad. And then she made her choice in favor of Ukrainian culture, but she was extremely highly educated. She was reading German without any problem. She was, if I'm not mistaken, the first writer to introduce in such a brilliant manner this German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche to the Ukrainian context, because not only she read him, but he was using some of his concepts in her novels. Like if you take Tsarivna, she was talking about this concept of Ubermensch, right? Superhuman, right? And she was talking about things which became important in the European prose much later. Let's have a look at her feminist agenda of Olga Kobylanska. Olga Kobylanska wrote Tsarivna. It is extremely feminist novel about female freedom, about creativity, about the right of underrepresented. I mean women which were underrepresented minority. I mean, culturally speaking, at that time she depicts the way of her heroine who was just hesitating between marriage and creation, and what choices she made in favor of creation. And she was using Nietzsche to argue that all of these will be important. So look at all the further discussions about feminism, like in European context, like Simone de Beauvoir, for sure, this iconic image of this European feminist, but all these things were known and were important decades after Olga Kobylanska. So Olga Kobylanska was talking about female friendship in her novel Valse Mélancolique, where you have purely female characters who discuss. One is musician, another is teacher, another is painter, and they are going their own ways in trying to put all the importance to their creation. So this is about creativity, this is about human rights, this is about feminist agenda, and all of this is happening in close dialogue with the European culture, and even decades before it became a mainstream, right? In the European literatures and culture. And Olga Kobylanska is not only so I started saying that, remember we read that at school and it was pretty boring, but Kobylanska wrote a lot of interesting things which Ukrainians discovered a little bit later, and some of them should be translated just to see. And maybe let's talk also about this problem of the Ukrainian culture, because there's a kind of asymmetry in the perception, because Ukrainians pretty much we do know what's happening in European cultures, because we read in English or in French or in German. There are a lot of translations, but when you talk about translations from Ukrainian into foreign languages, we discover that a lot of problems linked to that, and a lot of literal texts and other things are simply not translated into foreign languages, and foreigners cannot talk freely about Kobylanska or whatever we'll discuss later, Ukrainka later, right? So this is about translations, just to create the conditions for this kind of dialogue.
Look, even if we go deeper and let's say talk about the 18th century in Ukraine, the major figure is Grigory Skovoroda, who was writing his letters in Latin, and he was reading very easily the Latin texts, and he was really very deep into the Roman culture and Roman poetry. The first text in vernacular Ukrainian, we all know, is Aeneid by Ivan Kotlyarevsky. So it's a rethinking of Aeneid by Virgil, but well, the difference is that there were lots of Aeneids at the time. There were lots of attempts to, of a kind of a travesty of this work, of a kind of a, humoristic rewriting it. It was present in Russian context, it was present in Ukrainian context, it was present in German context, in all other contexts. So it was quite popular at the end of the 18th century to a little bit mock a little bit with this classical tradition that everybody studied. But it's probably only in Ukraine where the Aeneas became a national hero, a national character. And it's interesting how we Ukrainians define ourselves through a character that was created during the times of Augustus, during the birth of the Roman Empire, during the times of Christ, because this was the same time. Through this character of Aeneas, and I can go on with lots of fantasies how the very idea of Trojan War is present in the Ukrainian culture. Look, for example, at Lesya Ukrainka's Cassandra. Cassandra is a Trojan princess, is a prophetess that knows the truth about the future, but nobody believes her. And this is very, very important metaphor for Ukrainian culture. Look at also Iphigenia by Lesya Ukrainka. I hope we will talk about in some other episode, but who is Iphigenia? Iphigenia is also very much related to the Trojan War, and she's the daughter of Agamemnon who sacrifices her, but Artemis saves her in the last moment and brings where? She brings to Crimea, and the topos of Crimea becomes very, very important. And then topic of Iphigenia, you have Euripides, but then you have Goethe and you have Lesya Ukrainka and all this, very interesting 3D communication between them. Even if you take Romanticism, like Taras Shevchenko and others, well, the romantic metaphor of rebirth, regeneration, palingenesis was very, very much inscribed into the European currents of the day. And there are parallels with the Polish culture of the time. There are parallels with the French culture of the time, with the Scottish culture of the time. And the first half of the 19th century was really dreaming about this idea of regeneration. So it's kind of a really long story how you feel, how you see it's scattered around various times of literature and culture.
Yes, exactly. All these important, basic, fundamental stories of the European culture, Greek culture, Roman culture being present and in the Ukrainian literature. But at the same time, you mentioned in the beginning of our talk about Markovovchok, about this another female writing in our literature. So let's also have a look on what she wrote, basically, because when she writes her novel Marusia, and it was translated or adapted into French language by a French writer and somehow erased her name from the title, but we do know that this Marusia became a ever bestseller of the youth literature in France, and it was re-edited for more than 100 times in the French literature. So it became a classical thing for the French literature. So Ukrainian author who is present in foreign literature and being known. So these are things which we are to discuss and to show and to make them present in the current discourse about what the importance of Ukrainian literature is. Because look, do you know any kind of, I don't know, Russian author being translated and re-edited for hundreds of times in any European languages?
Look, there's a very interesting story about Marusia by Markovovchok, because the story is now told in detail by Irina Dmitryshin, a specialist in Ukrainian culture and literature in France at INALCO. So she re-edited Marusia and she found the manuscript, which was also the initial manuscript. And it's a very interesting read. Actually, yes, we can talk about the practical, how to say it, robbery of her text by her French editor and friend, who published it with some changes, but the core of the story was unchanged, but who published it under his proper name and with just a note that it is based upon the story of Markovovchok, and the very name of her was misspelled. And I read it personally. I can tell you that no, it is not based upon it. It's a real story that she wrote. He added something, and it's so funny that I literally read through the text. So the phrases that he added to the text were horrible. I mean, stylistically horrible from the ideas level. I can give a lecture on it, So he actually spoiled the text in the places that he edited. Then Dmitryshin shows us the first editing, and there were the images, the gravures by a French painter who were absolutely horrible, because basically they were depicting old Russian style and Russian clothes and Russian way of life. And for Ukrainians, it's obvious that it's so different. So it also shows how remote idea these people had. And it reminds us our context. We are making this podcast after this heating debate in the Oval Cabinet in the White House. And remember, J.D. Vance said that he actually he was not in Ukraine, but he learned it from stories. And then there are jokes about it. Yeah, I've been to Ukraine through Google Maps. So this is really the repetition of all that. But what is interesting, why this French editor was interested in this text? Because the image of Marusia reminded him the image of Jeanne d'Arc, and he actually uses it. And B, it was after the French lost the Franco-Prussian War, and therefore this idea that there is an empire, there is another foreign country that grabs your land, takes your land, is an aggressor, was dear to French mind in the 1870s and 1880s. Therefore, yes, our Ukrainian culture speaks much more to those countries who have kind of an experience like we do.
Yeah, who suffer and and there is
And who
also
fight.
adventure. So don't forget, it was for teenagers. So this is a youth literature, but he saw this potential for young audiences. Like talking the story, because the main character is Marusia, is a kid really. So he's crossing the country, and yes, indeed, if I'm not mistaken, his name was Etzel or something like that, right? This French writer who adapted this text into French, in the French vision. So I can make a debate. We will not make a debate about the quality of this adaptation, but Markovovchuk is behind this story, and this is a Ukrainian author who spoke many languages. And by the way, he translated Jules Verne, French author, into Russian, right? Into Russian, the whole thing. I mean, a lot of volumes, and even the Soviet edition, if I'm not mistaken, this one we were reading when we were kids. It was translated by Markovovchuk, so she was a close friend or acquaintance of Jules Verne in France, or in other classics of these teenagers literature, so adventure literature, which was extremely popular in the Soviet times, and she was translating. So we were basically reading the text written by Markovovchuk, right? So for Russians as well, and nobody just talked about her as about Ukrainian also.
Look, there were lots of ways how the global culture was entering Russia through Ukrainians. The obvious example is Homer. The Iliad and Odyssey were translated by one Poltava guy who was called Hnidich, and we know him by the surname Hnedich, which is a Russian version of this Ukrainian name Hnidich. Why? So our audience can ask, so why Poltava guy, and again Kotlarevsky, another Poltava guy who again speaks about the Roman antiquity, and Hnidich translates the Greek antiquity? Well, because they were alumni of this Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, where the long tradition of classical studies in Greek and Latin were very presented. Just to give you an example, that when Petro Mohyla was the metropolite of Kiev Church, and he was also the patron of this academy. But initially he had a school at Lavra, the biggest Kiev university. He started printing books in Latin, and he started teaching in Latin, despite the fact that this was Orthodoxy fighting against Catholicism in the 17th century, and the Latin was the language of Catholicism. But despite all that, these guys said, okay, we should be better prepared. So you have all this tradition of different Kiev intellectuals like Theophan Prokopovich and Stefan Yavorsky, and these guys around Peter I, who helped Peter build his empire, unfortunately, through the European education, through their knowledge of different languages, and then up to the point of the 18th century, when you have the Russian translator of Homer being a Ukrainian.
Yes, exactly. This deep knowledge of this European tradition, but at the same time, I would also argue. Let's talk about modernist time once again. Let's take, for example, Vasil Stefanik. And Ukrainian author from Bukovina. So somebody whom we call Ukrainian expressionist because he's an extremely strong, powerful, short novels, sometimes 1 page or 2 pages. It's
Then
like
not novels, but stories.
stories like very short one and very in his expressionist style. And somebody like Stefanik, he was also German speaking. He'd been to Austria, he'd been to Vienna, he'd been to many.
Was a member of parliament.
Deputy there, and he also made the choice for the Ukraine, for being present in the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian literature. And all these people, they were quite aware and quite well informed about what was going on abroad. I mean, of all these modernist movements in Germany or in Austria, in whatever. So, and they were, what Stefanik was doing for our literature is expressionism. So, remember, like his short texts about like news when he's talking the story of the father who drowned both of his who wanted to drown both of his daughters because of the famine, because it's a story of a extremely poor family and he couldn't afford to feed his own kids. So extremely heartbreaking story. And some others about the destiny of Ukrainians in Bukovina who were traveling abroad and specifically to the United States, like Kamilny Khrest, and all these extremely powerful prose, which simply is not fully translated once again into foreign languages, just to make it visible for further discussion.
I absolutely agree. I think if somebody asks me like what author to start with to enter the Ukrainian literature, I would name Stefanik. And I don't know about translations. It should be quite easy to translate. Of course, his language, I mean, this is the early 20th century for our listeners, the late 19th, early 20th century. This is its time of Habsburg Empire. And yes, well, he's writing in a Ukrainian, which is probably difficult to translate because it's full with dialectism of Pokutya and of his lands. But still, if you know quite a bit and you know the language, the translation should come because it's so strong and it's so short. So you can have a story of 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages, and it just blows up your mind, story after story after story after story. And again, if we're talking about the global nature, we always mention, of course, Lesya Ukrainka. So Lesya Ukrainka, whom we call with you the greatest Ukrainian writer who ever lived, and she's strong primarily because of her poetry, but primarily because of her dramas. So we have our own Shakespeare, we have our own Euripides, and this is equally strong. And the topics that she takes are actually taken most often from this long tradition of European drama. So we mentioned Iphigenia, we can mention Cassandra, we can mention her play about the way how Christianity and the classical antique Roman culture meet through the couple of people, the Rufina and Priscilla. We can think about Don Juan's story, the stone host, etc. We have talked about this previously. But really, I think, and Orgy, of course, which shows the conflict between the Greeks and the Romans in the same way as probably she thought about Ukrainians and Russians. But really, I think Lesya Ukrainka was the one who localized Ukrainian topics into the global topics, or maybe she localized the global topics inside Ukrainian topics. And I think the strongest part in her is that every of her play is the conflict of big value systems. So you take Rufina Priscilla, this is a conflict between Roman and classical values and the new Christian values. If you take Don Juan, the stone host, it's a conflict between different versions of freedom. If you take Cassandra, it's a conflict between different versions of truth, and it's so powerful and it's so important today.
Yes, so Lesya Ukrainka is our Ukrainian Shakespeare, right? Our Olga Kobylanska is our Ukrainian Simone de Beauvoir. Vasil Stefanik is our expressionist. I don't know whom compared Stefanik. And let's talk about this Ukrainian avant-garde, which was annexed in the largest part, was annexed by this Russian Empire. And let's talk about the place where all started. So when you read, I don't know, these Russian manuals and textbooks about Russian avant-garde, they will probably mention this decisive year of 1912, if I'm not mistaken, and 12, right? And this Ukrainian steppe in the Kherson region, so now where the battlefields are, and battles are taking place in this between occupied left bank of Dnipro River and that place, and so and they will mention this Chernyanka village where brothers Burluk, I mean from the old Cossacks families, these both brothers Volodymyr and David, who were both poets and painters at the same time, and they had their family nest where they invited a lot of talented people from Moscow, sometimes from St. Petersburg, where, for example, Mayakovsky was present, and where Khlebnikov, which is one of the genius poet, they considered him to be a genius poet of the Russian language, avant-garde, from the avant-garde. But Khlebnikov, when being present in Kherson region, he was writing about even not Russian language, but this kind of mixture of Slavonic language, Russian, maybe Ukrainian, etc., etc. So everything started in these Ukrainian steppes. We now consider like something that links Ukrainian culture to this Mediterranean culture. I mean, to this Greek culture. So we seriously discussed that all these steps were a part of this ancient culture. So, and this universal, we are talking about universal importance of the things. So avant-garde is a very specific type of culture, right? So there are guys who are talking about the zero starting from the scratch, like acting as if all the previous culture never existed. And so this Ukrainian step became such a place, and it happens at a precise time where Malevich, who was born in Kyiv, right, in a Polish family, and who spoke Polish and who spoke Ukrainian as a second language, and whose father was in an industrial here in the Ukrainian cities, and later on he moved to Russia, who was just starting to paint. And he had many periods, he had all these Fauvisms, he had all these other periods before coming to suprematism, so this non-figurative painting a little bit later in 1915. So his Ukrainian paintings, well, and all of this, a lot of these people were mainly annexed later by this discourse of the great Russian avant-garde, which is extremely important and extremely well known in many museums. We can talk about Sonia Delaunay, right? So for those of you who know Sonia Delaunay, we know her as a prominent woman who became a French painter and founder of this so-called simultaneism. Simultaneism, like she was talking about the presence of different colors at the same time, and this is not only about painting. This is also about print, about print for clothes, about simultaneous clothes, about everything, about furniture, about fashion. And this Sonia Delaunay, she was born in Odessa, and she lived for 5 years of her childhood in Ukraine. And she remembers that. And she states in her autobiography that all I invented about colors and about the very heart of my painting, it's linked to what I've seen as a little kid at the Ukrainian wedding. I mean, when there are a lot of bright colors and in these traditional costumes of Ukrainian bride or whatever. So she stated that in the autobiography. So it links all these fashion and all this simultaneism career, which was extremely prominent. If I'm not mistaken, Sonia Delaunay was presented in Louvre, and she was, even if not mistaken, the first woman to be presented at Louvre Museum as during her living, so not after her death, but she was still alive, and she was Ukrainian, by the way. So a lot of dialects and a lot of creations started from Ukraine at these important years of avant-garde, like which is a time where you reject for sure this tradition, but you try to found another tradition, to look at the world differently, etc.
That's a very important topic, and I would add on this a little bit. So, what value added the Ukrainian culture was actually bringing to the global avant-garde? If we take Sonia Delaunay, it's of course the question of colors. So, the question of colors and the way how you treat colors and the way how colors are actually present in the folk culture, it's a very interesting topic. Malevich. So Malevich is such a remarkable story because, well, the steppe is really present in his paintings, right? If you look at his paintings, it's always when you look at this painting where there are figures of peasants who looks like a little bit like Ukrainian motanki. Motanki is the toys that Ukrainians are making out of clothes, and most often they are toys without faces or with crosses through their faces. So it's very popular topic in Ukraine, and you can feel it in Malevich. But then what is on the background? On the background there is a big steppe, and the big steppe is very linear. So it's really this suprematism or this simplicity, the cubism probably. Maybe it comes from the landscape itself, because everybody who was in the Ukrainian steppes understands, that this is a perfect line of the horizon.
Yes, exactly. So it provides a very vivid visual image of what this avant-garde was. But let's also talk about cinema.
I thought you were wanting to jump in with Malevich, because I just finished with Malevich and then go to cinema. Just think about the enigma of Malevich. Malevich is somebody who, before doing suprematism, he was doing the Cubo-futurism, right? So it was a combination, again, of different styles, of the French Cubism and of Italian Futurism. And there are his famous paintings, very good paintings, when he combines the styles. But look, both Cubism and Futurism were thinking about the mystery of movement. They were trying to present this mystery of movement, the technological, industrial movement, in different way. But Malevich, when he enters suprematism, he rejects movements, and he thinks about something which is beyond movement. And I think if you look at his Black Square, first association that I have about the Black Square, we understand the Black Square is a very mystical painting. He wrote about this a lot. He was really thinking in terms of kind of a mysterious, mystical, new religion probably. For me, it's a kind of a symbol of this apophatic painting. So like we have apophatic theology when we can say nothing about God. Because all the epithets about God, all these attributes cannot really define him. So as if Malevich is painting the God through this big black square. But you can also think about Ukrainian black earth, the famous Chornozem, the blackness of this earth, and in some places, especially in the steppes. And we know that with you very much. It is so black that it really looks like the black of the black, like the black square, but it's a force of life. So, and it's a force of repetitive life. It's not just a force of this surface, movement and of how wheels are moving, etc. But it's really something very, very deep.
Yeah, extremely interesting. But suprematism is not only about black square. And let's not forget that there are a lot of research in recent years about how this all started. I mean, this first exhibition of Malevich in suprematism, 0.10. So, and in a way, how this suprematism idea is linked to Ukrainian traditional broderie. The first suprematism paintings of Malevich, they're linked to traditional Ukrainian broderie, to vyshivanka, and to this atelier they had at that time, and they were trying to combine his design with traditional Ukrainian design, I mean popular design. So it was white on the white, and there were a lot of some of the pictures which were published recently, and we can easily situate this extra ultra modern, ultra avant-garde idea of going beyond the images and transgression the reality into some mystical image. It has deeper roots into Ukrainian culture. I mean, in the popular culture as it is. This Davidova atelier somewhere in Verbivka, this village, a Ukrainian village, when they were cultivating such type of cooperation between artists coming from the capital and these women from women from village women who were just making this broderie, and so Malevich is about that. And let's talk a little bit about cinema. So you were talking about movement, about time, and this everybody knows. Everybody knows Dziga Vertov, this famous, they call it him sometimes Ukrainian, sometimes Russian. He was Jewish, born in Poland, and then so in these empire times. And he was an extremely avant-garde filmmaker who made many different things, like in his concepts of kino oko, cinema eye, so like fixing everything with an eye. And a lot of this film was in 24 was done in Kyiv and in Odessa and not in Moscow. And he's also an author of this extremely interesting film Enthusiasm, Symphony of Donbass Symphony, where he's the first film where he uses the sound film, and he uses a lot of industrial sounds of industrialized Donbass, Ukrainian Donbass at the time. So Dziga Vertov was linked to Ukrainian culture, and contrary to the fact that you meet him normally as a Russian filmmaker somewhere everywhere in the world, he spent a lot of time in Ukraine. He worked a lot in Ukraine, and most of his films were done in Ukraine. And by the way, specifically because the censorship in the years he created, I mean late 20s and the beginning of 30s, the censorship became harder in Moscow first, and you still was able to create something in Lviv, in Kyiv or in Odessa, things which were already censored in Moscow and St. Petersburg. We were approaching these cruel years of 30s in Soviet Empire, when a lot of intelligentsia and creative people were eliminated both in Ukraine and in Russia, right? So Dziga Vertov, a world-known filmmaker, so also has all these links to Ukrainian landscape and to Ukrainian identity and to Ukrainian cities like Kyiv and Odessa, right? And Donbass, and Donbass, all these industrials. This is the first ever sound film in Ukrainian tradition, and it is about Donbass, and it's about industrialization of Donbass. It was all these noises of industrialization, with all these trains, all these plants, and all this machinery in Donbass.
And then we have Alexander Dovzhenko, of course, whose film Land or Earth, Zemlya, is considered to be one of the most important films of all time in the global history. And of course, we can critically assess this film on the level of ideology, because it's really the ideological message is dubious when we know the history that happens next, because the ideological message is that those rich peasants are evil and those poor peasants are good, and therefore you should base your economy on this collectivizing these good peasants and killing or marginalizing the rich peasants, the so-called kurkul. But from the level of style, it's really, really very avant-gardist and very interesting and very captivating. I would like to mention one more thing. And this is the question of values. This is a question of history. Ukrainian culture of the 20th century knows something that not very often other cultures know. And this is what it's like to be between two totalitarianisms. What it's like to be inside the the world wars, when there are big players are attacking you from everywhere. We can talk about the First World War, where basically Ukraine was one of the key battlefields when armies were meeting here, the armies of the Habsburg monarchy and the armies of the Russian Empire, and then Ukrainians needed in the need to serve in both. And then you have the war for independence, when Ukraine is basically attacked from everywhere. I mean, people know about Russian civil war. Okay, Russians are attacked from it, but look, it's nothing compared to Ukraine, because Ukraine is attacked by the Red Russians, by the White Russians, by the Poles, by the Germans, by the Austrians, and there's a huge number of internal fight and internal civil war with all these little warlords. And then when it's over, when Ukrainians lose our independence war, we are in a situation between two totalitarianisms already in the 30s, when, for example, both the Stalinism and the Nazism are thinking about starving people into death. The difference is that Stalin does it and kills at least 4 million Ukrainian peasants in 32-33. And by the way, he kills also the peasants in Kazakhstan. And Hitler is dreaming about this. One of the plans of Hitler is also come to Ukraine, to Belarus, to Poland maybe, and starve people into death. And then you have the very, very difficult situation, for example, and still there is no thorough understanding what happened during the Second World War, how to think about the Ukrainian resistance of the time, how to think about Ukrainian resurgent army, because there is a heroic discourse about UPA, there is a condemning discourse about UPA, but both these discourses are probably simplifying things. And you have all these people who became the DP, the displaced persons, who then created a lot of Ukrainian culture abroad, starting from Yuri Shevelov and Yuri Kosach, and then Ivan Bahryan and many others. And then you have novels and thinking. And I'm particularly thinking about Ivan Bahryan, who is a writer who went through the camps in the Soviet Union, up to Siberia, up to the borders of China, and he wrote a novel about this, which is called Tiger Catches, Tigrelove. And then he went from the Soviet Union during the Second World War, and he wrote 2 major novels. One is about the Soviet Gulag, which is called the Getsemani Garden, which was published in early 1950s, 1/4 of century, 25 years before the novel of Solzhenitsyn about Archipelago Gulag was known in the West. And another big novel is Людина біжить над прірвою, a human being runs above the abyss, which is a novel about what it's like to be between the two totalitarianisms in this Second World War.
Yeah, so that is to say that Ukrainian culture and literature, this is not only, so we have to elaborate a kind of an inclusive concept of what Ukrainian literature and culture is, because not only that culture and literature which stayed in this prison of the empire for centuries before and for decades of the Soviet culture, right, which was eliminated or then provincialized. We were talking of that in the beginning, which was presented like popular culture but not high culture. But we also have to be inclusive, because Malevich is not so-called Ukrainian, so this is not ethnic criteria to include somebody to the Ukrainian culture and culture and literature. So we are talking about Olga Kobylanska, which is basically German. So she's basically German culture, or somebody who, but we also have to include into this concept of the Ukrainian culture all these generations and people who escaped this prison of, this Soviet prison for many reasons, between the wars, during the Second World War, and who created Ukrainian classics. So you mentioned Bahryan, it's classical now, so kids in school, they study that at school. So this is important milestones of what we call today Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian culture. So we need a kind of dynamic model of what Ukrainian literature and culture are, because they are not linear. They are not, because of this, a lot of historical tragedies, because of Holodomors, because of civil war, because of both World War, because of the empire which has been there for many centuries and decades, and now is still wanting to destroy Ukrainian statehood, Ukrainian identity, and Ukrainian culture. We need this dynamic vision of what Ukrainian culture and history and literature is.
And it certainly goes way beyond just Ukrainian language and Ukrainian ethnicity, because we have Polish intellectuals like Volodymyr Antonovich or like Vyacheslav Lipinski. We have German ethnic Germans like Mike Johansen and Yuri Shevelov, and people who are inscribed into the German-speaking culture like Olga Kobylanska. We have, as I said, a lot of literature in Latin during the Renaissance and Baroque times. We have Jewish-speaking and Yiddish-speaking culture, and it's very interesting that, for example, the Nobel Prize winner Agnon is deeply linked with Buchach, for example, and we have literature in Yiddish like Shalom Aleichem and many others, and we have also the Russian speakers. Why not? So Russian-speaking Ukrainian literature, if it does not pretend to be the dominant one, but one of the many, and of course the Kirimli, very important, Crimean Tatar, and I think we can go on with this, because it's this richness of other ethnicities, of Greeks, of Bulgarians, of Belarusians, of Turkic speaking. It's very, very interesting. So we will end on this. This is a topic that deserves a lot of attention, and we will probably continue some of the topics in one of the next episodes. This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld, and the president of PEN Ukraine. My co-host today was Tetyana Ogarkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar and author of the French language podcast L'Ukraine face à la guerre by the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. We are lecturers at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, the oldest university in Ukraine. We greatly appreciate your support of our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your contribution is crucial, as our media increasingly depends on crowdfunding. Additionally, you can support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas where we provide aid to both soldiers and civilians. We bring essential supplies such as scarves for soldiers and books for civilians. You can support our trips by donating through PayPal at ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is produced in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.